Um, Good evening, everybody. Extremely pleased and happy for your response, for your super response. We had more than 110 registrations, and I'm sure people are joining in. We are also live on Facebook. The number of registrations was very exciting simply because it means that people want to have a conversation around this very, very important topic called restoring our earth. And people definitely, once conversations start, actions happen. And of course, things are, we have to take actions very, very fast. I mean, there cannot be a lag between a conversation and an action. So we hardly have any time, and we have to just kind of up the ante and get started, get on the ground, up and running. And I'm happy that we are doing this webinar today and actually discussing and talking about ways to restore our earth. And one of the ways of restoring our earth is definitely rewilding. And we have some amazing panelists among us, amidst us. We have one of my favorite authors, Pranay Lal, who has written this fabulous book called Indica, and I will of course introduce him a little later. And we have two very, very passionate conservationists, Ketaki and Manasi, who have been doing a lot of work on rewilding front. And welcome you all for this webinar. And I'm sure this will start a lot of action across India, on ground action. And it'll be wonderful to actually get to know from all of you about how this webinar has helped you maybe uh, uh, concretize your thoughts, concretize your actions, and actually take it forward. What you have been wanting to do and thinking about doing, take it forward. Little introduction. My name is Sarika Kulkarni, and I'm your host for the day. I'm also the founder of Raha Foundation. We started Raha Foundation about 10 years ago, exactly in 2010. We started by three professionals, who wanted to use our knowledge, our background, our experience to make a change in the world. We had no clue about the development sector. It was just the passion that drove us to the development sector. The first 3 years were spent on self-incubation. We were just learning by doing. As I said, we don't come from traditional social work background, so we were just learning by doing. We were doing a lot of experiments. We were meeting a lot of amazing people. We were learning about best practices. We were absorbing everything we could. We were reading a lot of books, so absorbing everything. And finally in 2014 we actually started working with the tribals of Maharashtra. And over a period of time, our program has evolved and organically, and we now take an integrated approach to tribal development. We work on water, agriculture, women livelihood and micro business creation, tribal art revival, health, and most importantly, climate change. In climate change, we are doing both adaptation as well as mitigation. In adaptation, we are preparing our tribal communities to become much more climate change aware, and giving them measures of identifying the risks that they are at, and and of course giving them tools to mitigate those risks. We are working with children, tribal students. We are working with farmers. We are working with all stakeholders and making them aware about climate change. On mitigation front, we are doing two things. One is, of course, climate resilient agricultural practices and rewilding. We have already planted over 1 lakh of trees across two blocks of Jawar and Mokhada in Palghar district near Mumbai. We are now embarking on a very, very ambitious project where we will be taking up 10 acres of land and converting this barren land completely into a green oasis. And this was a great time to talk about our experiences and take this conversation forward, because we are absolutely passionate about this rewilding project that we are embarking on. And so before taking too much time, let me introduce you to the webinar. It's Rewilding to Restore Our Earth. And we have, as I said, eminent panel. Before I invite the panelists, I would request you to put your questions in the chat box. We did receive a lot of questions on email, and we have a young moderator who's going to moderate this panel discussion. Still, if you think you want to ask something to either of the panelists, kindly put it in the chat box. It is my great pleasure now to introduce Sri Pranay Lal. public health advocate and natural history writer of bestseller Indica, a deep natural history of the Indian subcontinent. Indica is definitely one of the, it is and will remain as one of the top 5 books I have ever read in my life. Over to you, Pranay. Thank you so much for bringing Indica to us, and over to you. Your thoughts are very, very important in this very critical juncture our Earth is in today. Over to you.
Chronic problem. People don't unmute themselves. I think there should be a term for it very soon. Um, Thank you so much for the invitation from Raha Foundation and my co-panelists Ketki and Manasi from Oikos, and Saryu for actually putting it all together and curating this. I'm a complete misfit. If you're going to ask me about rewilding, I don't know much about it. I've just been what I tell my friends I'm a magpie. I just pick up stories from everywhere and I put them together. I do the same with rewilding. I just learn from friends and their friends, and this is what I learned. So I'm actually looking forward to the presentation that Ketsuki and Mansi are going to make, and there's so much to learn. So my only understanding is that I am, like I said, I'm a magpie. I keep asking questions and I keep collecting facts, and that's how Indica happened. So Indica is actually, it's a labor of 22 years of work. Um, I think I'm going to just talk about how we got here, and what is it that, I mean, how is it India, that what makes India so fascinating in terms of landscapes and forests and our rivers and ponds and everything else. So I think if you were in the first band of people, of humans who came at the bank of the Indus around 48,000 years ago, that was the time of distress that happened, when the earth had one of its early climate shocks that had happened, and it had forced people from Africa to leave and go in different directions. So one of the bands left along the Red Sea and along the Persian Gulf and came to the banks of Indus. And what they would have seen is a wonderful river, a very wide Indus, filled with rhinoceros and many, many beautiful antelopes and wonderful creatures of all kinds, even ostriches, for example. And that sight would have been of something to behold, because that river was mighty. And today, if you were to look back and look at the Indus, you can actually cross the Indus on certain times of the year without wetting your feet. It is dry, and it's a calamity that we have brought up on ourselves, because we've been damming all the tributaries that leave India and go into Pakistan. So our rivers have been strangled and they've been suffocated. And that's the fate of just about every river in the world. We are now commemorating 10 years of the war in Syria, and Syria is a classic example of a war caused by damming and stopping rivers from flowing. The three major rivers in Syria that flow in and out of Syria are Jordan, Euphrates, and Tigris. All of them are heavily dammed. The water has shrunk, and the three major communities there ended up fighting with each other for fertile land and water and whatever. So I think we have enough examples, and I think you were right in saying that climate change is a major problem. And let's come back to India. And I think the first shock 48,000 years ago in the Indus, when you come and see a lovely river, it's teeming with animals and resplendent with plants and grasses and just about everything wonderful. The second shock that happened is more recent, actually. It happened between, somewhere between 1350 and 1815, what is called the Little Ice Age. And that is the period when you notice that the European expansionism happened, and Europe was in a deep freeze, and they were forced out to look for tropical places to exploit. And the third, more importantly, event happened very, very recently. Actually, if you were to look at, if you are somebody from Gujarat or in Rajasthan, the 1819 earthquake, I don't know whether you know about this, but there was a major earthquake called the Allahabad earthquake, which happened in 1819 and raised parts of Gujarat by as much as 2 to 8 meters. And in one day, right? And that changed the drainage pattern and created a lot of different things that happened in the western margin of India. I'm still at the western margin. I'm not even going eastwards or coming south. I'm still here. My only submission here is that what was happening then at that time was that the tropical forests, the grasslands, the savannas, everything was changing drastically. And India, because of the population that came in, the streaming of people, the regular sortie of people kept coming in. Where first in, with people leaving Africa, and then after agricultural expansion that happened in the Middle East, in Levant area, people were streaming in all the time into India. And India became a repository of not just knowledge and biodiversity, but also a huge population. India has always been a country teeming with people. And so India has always been worked, the soil has been worked and reworked, the forests have been created and recreated, destroyed and redestroyed. And with these three climate shocks that I told you about, the major one, of course, 48,000 years ago, the little ice age that happened between 1350 and 1850, a minor one, and a very tiny one, which was perhaps for only one day, and that was in 1819. So I'm telling you about three large swathes of time. We have significant impact on what happens to the terrestrial environment. And our grasslands expanded and became fascinating. I'm particularly fascinated by grasslands. And now the term that we are trying to define here is rewilding. And one of the casualties of rewilding is grasslands. Anybody who sees an open space and they say, oh, yahan pe ped lagana chahiye, let's do vriksharopan, let's do afforestation, let's do rehabilitation. A grassland by itself is teeming with life. It has as much biodiversity and carbon repository as any other biome that you can find. So it is a travesty that we actually push it to that limit. And my worry about this obsession to convert grasslands into forests is twofold. One, of course, is the loss of the grassland and the biodiversity, what I call the specialists, in the niche specialists that exist there. And the second thing that happens is the concern about water. I don't know whether you noticed that, water is almost perennial in grasslands and savannas. And if you were to convert a grassland into a forested area, the first casualty are streams. And you would notice that wildfires increase in the grasslands once forests are created. That's one thing. And California as an example, Australia as an example. They were large grasslands in which we forced eucalyptus and pines and other things. That's the first example. The second thing is, of course, desiccation, or the water gets concentrated in the tree line areas, and grasses tend to survive. Because they can survive, they live in water stress all the time, and the streams dry up. And there is enough evidence even within India that show that as much as 50 to 20% decline of water takes place in streams, and streams that had never dried out start to dry out for some times of the year. So I think I'm going to stop here, because I think I want to listen to my other co-panelists and not take too much time. But yeah, I just want to conclude by saying that I have not finished that story of the Indus, but I just want to bring you to the point that why grasslands which were created started to form 48 to 30,000 years ago, and then the Little Ice Age 1350 to 1850, and then the more recent tinkerings that happened in the earth. Now we have fascinating grasslands. I mean, in Maharashtra, you're actually spoiled by choice. There's such fascinating grasslands in all over Maharashtra. There's also Banni grasslands in Gujarat. Then you have something which is very unique among the grasslands in India. And I think there are only 6 or 7 places where you see this phenomenon. And I think I would like to tell your listeners today. It's something called Cheer Batti. I don't know whether you've heard about it. It's called the Cheer Batti. It's in the Little Run of Kutch. It's a seasonal wetland which is adjacent to the Banni grassland in the Chari Dand area. And what does Cheer Batti means? Batti, as you know, it means light, right? And Cheer in Kutchi means ghost. Now, grasslands produce a variety of gases which are very, very interesting, which are stabilizing the climate and all of those other things. And I'm not going to get into the biochemical and the geophysical benefits of grasslands. But what Cheer Batti does is this, that it releases a gas called phosgene and methane. And once the temperature is just right, when the first rains are about to come, you see these ghost lights. They look like headlights and they're moving up. And they go and collide. And it looks like Aurora Borealis, not as grand. And it happens only for a few hours. And it is called Cheer Batti because the locals thought that there were ghosts in the air. And it is a phenomenon that you see only in 6 or 7 places in the world. And it's been seen and reported only 8 times in modern times. It's not a regular feature. You're not going to see it annually. It happens very rarely. That's because grasslands are getting destroyed. There's too much light anyways. Phosgene production, methane production is also declining on the topsoil. All those concerns that we have with destruction of grasslands. So I'm not going to, spend too much time, because I can keep speaking about grasslands and how I love them. Not that I don't love trees or forests. I mean, please don't get me wrong. But what I'm trying to say is, let us not forsake grasslands and savannas and open lands that are unique biodiversity areas, need special conservation in lieu of our obsession to plant trees alone. So I'll end here and I'll give it back to Isha.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pranay. In fact, Bunny Grasslands is a great memory. Of course, now travel has got restricted to memories. So 2 consecutive years, we have done Bunny Grasslands and could see some unbelievable birds, raptors. I mean, what an experience it was. And I can absolutely resonate with what you just said. Thank you so much. And we will now go to our passionate women, Ketaki Ghate and Manasi Karandikar. They are conservationists and they are the co-founders of Oikos for Ecological Services. Thank you so much for joining us, Ketaki and Manasi. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so maybe we'll just quickly share our screen. But before that, just to connect to what Pranay was saying, so absolutely that's the first lesson in ecology, that you respect the local ecosystem. If it is a grassland or savanna, it's a forest, and then try to restore that. So that's very much first lesson. That's a very apt starting for this session, I think. And maybe, but right now we're going to share a case study for forest restoration. But I think maybe we can talk about grassland restoration in maybe Q&A and other discussion sessions. Yeah, so because the topic is about rewilding, so how actually we can go about this with the help of ecological restoration, and we're going to talk this with respect to a case study. So restoration obviously is nothing. So there are many complex scientific definitions, but this is a simple definition, I think, which can be understood by our audience here, that to bring back original or known previous conditions. So whatever we know as a history, we can just bring it back. Or there are many reference ecosystem in the landscape itself, that how the landscape should have been, or it was a few years back, and with reference to that, you can actually restore the landscape. So normally we say, so obviously there are various ways to restoration. So it depends on the availability of lands, how big is the land chunk, and the resources, the time you have, also the patience. There are many things. So we say that best practice is assisted eco restoration, and sometimes, many times, people are really fond of doing plantation. But when we say, so that definitely can be segregated based on all the 4 factors that I said in the first point. So plantation, normally we don't focus if it's pure ecological restoration project. So, and also the restoration strategies changes whether the land is in natural area or it is in rural area or in urban area. So strategies and the techniques and everything definitely would change. So here comes the, used to just add, no. So this is the case study, the project Ranwa. So Ranwa is a Marathi word for wilderness, and this is from Western Ghats and from Taluka Patan and district Satara. The one Kusavde is the name of this village.
Yeah. So while starting with this case study, we would just like to introduce you to our organization, that is Oikos for Ecological Services, which we started some 19 years back in 2002. And the aim was to have biodiversity conservation and restoration on land.
Looks like there is some network issue at Ketki and Mansi's end. Anyway, what's webinar or Zoom without a technical glitch, right?
Absolutely.
I mean,
so
I think,
would you like to take a question in case we are stuck, or is there something that has come, Isha, if you want to, or Sarika?
So before that, let me quickly introduce Isha. to moderate, we have invited Isha, who's a young, passionate climate action advocate working in various areas of energy transition. She has extensively worked with youths from across the world to create intergenerational dialogue on climate change. Since the burden of climate crisis will be faced by our next generation, we thought it is important to engage them in today's conversation. Yeah, over to you, Isha.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here and listening to Pranay. Also, really inspiring to hear your experiences and the importance of grasslands. Definitely overlooked, I think. I guess one question that I did have for you was around your book. So me and all of us actually, we all know about your book, and it's considered really accessible to the masses and really a good example of communication. But I guess I wanted to understand how do you think we can make this need for rewilding and its particulars more accessible to more people, so that they understand the importance and also participate in this endeavor with us?
Yeah, I think, now more than ever, the importance of rewilding is, coming back to fore. I think our governments, I mean, globally, governments have failed. Whether it's people in countries like Canada or even the Nordic countries wanting to do line plantations of conifers. Now, the line plantations that you see in India, except for teak and sal, which was only for plantation purpose, it actually defeats the entire purpose of rewilding, or even restoring, say, a stream downstream, or water conservation, soil conservation. More importantly, I think all those benefits are lost. I think just by just to put timber on land and make people believe that you're going to get gains in terms of timber is not enough. In fact, that single patch of soil or piece of land can be put to so much more use, because that's what nature does. Nature uses several stories of plants and animals to put together carbon. And there are two elements that are very key to life. One is silica, or silicon rather, and carbon. And the combinations of these two is what is important. I mean, silicon is, of course, in sand and soils and everything else, and carbon and how silicon interacts in different formats in terms of different compounds. Now, we must understand this perspective completely. What is I think the whole climate science is currently skewed, and I think we are also not responding to a lot of requests or ideas and thoughts that are needed to feed into the technological breakthroughs we need to fix climate. And I think that's where the disjointing of both these paradigms exist. And I think we actually are not just disjointed, but also at a flashpoint, because we have nothing in terms of viable options. And I noticed there are two questions on market-based solutions, which we can talk about a little later. But I think we've got Ketuki and Manasi back, and I hope their mics are on. They can put them on. Yeah. Okay. Please, sorry. We were just filling it.
There was some problem with the internet. Not sure what happened.
Yeah.
Yes. So quickly, we'll share the presentation.
Yeah, so I was talking about how we started all this, and so then we started working with these private landowners for conservation and restoration. And while doing so, we also worked on the propagation of native plants, because that was a key issue that was lagging behind. So we started a nursery of native plants, and that is how we started working on both these aspects of restoration and plantation. And eventually we have been now working on various projects with private landowners of restoration, sacred groves, then with resort owners, with township developers, and many others who seek our advice for like the precise title that we have, rewilding their land to have some more biodiversity. Yeah, so we will look at this case study.
Yeah, so the idea is actually most of the people, if they integrate this restoration, otherwise what happens, there are only environmentalists and the nature lovers who do restoration, right? But actually it's each and every of us who need to actually look at ecological restoration in a very positive way. And it's not only a job of environmentalists, but everyone should be able to do that. And that's why we work with this range of people, right from the environmentalists to private people to communities, local people, everyone. So yeah, so here comes this case study, which would definitely give you an idea that what rewilding is about. So this is a regional setting, and many of you might know that this is Western Ghats, and being Western Ghats, it literally pours over there. The kind of rainfall it has is almost 5,000 millimeters average annual, more than 1,000 meters above sea level. So all these things are there. So this is a regional setting, and it's also one of the biodiversity hotspot. And all of us know that this Western Ghats, they support some kind of tropical semi-evergreen forest as a climax ecosystem. That's what we call it as. So unlike grasslands, which are there in the central India, so this tiny belt of Western Ghats is, they're like full with forests with endemic, rare, and threatened biodiversity. So this is how the land was. Initially, it was completely barren, lack of canopy was there, and poor fertility of soil, intense grazing was there, high-speed winds still there. So in this, obviously, restoration becomes a little difficult, and obviously, it's going to take time. So what we did initial entire year, we did ecological assessment for the entire catchment, and that's how we got to know about this sacred growth, the patches which are preserved since maybe centuries or definitely many centuries. So that suggests that this particular project land also was having that kind of forest. I mean, if you talk to even just elderly people in the village, they would tell us that, yeah, for sure, 50 years back, this particular patch was having a very dense forest. But now, because of intense human interference, now the forests are not there, and that's how you see completely degraded patch. So we decided to take this land patch to forest formation, but obviously that's going to take good long time. No one really knows that how much time it will take. So what we thought, just to accelerate this succession on the land, so that land is just set on the right track to go towards forest formation. And these are very simple restoration techniques that we've applied here, like protection, control on wood cutting, grazing, soil and water conservation measures, stream restoration, and very lastly, plantation of native plants. But this was definitely was not a focus for this particular project, at least. And the results we got, as you see in this photograph, we use a thorn fence just to protect the land. And also we had decided for this particular project to keep our ecological and carbon footprint for the entire project to the minimum. So we didn't prefer to maybe get in external resources and have carbon footprint somewhere else and then try to green it on some other patch. So instead of that, we preferred everything local so that this footprint is lower. So as a result, you could see the biomass improved like anything. So inside the fence, it would grow almost 5 feet tall, and outside the fence, it's hardly anything, just few inches. So this biomass in ecological restoration or any rewilding project, this is a free wealth. This is an extremely important wealth for ecological restoration projects. So this actually changes the entire ecology of the topsoil. Then we also had live hedges. So the plants which are not eaten by cattle are planted all along the hedge. Again, needless to say that these are all native plants and they formed as excellent habitat for smaller fauna initially. Then in Western Ghats, people set the land on fire very much deliberately. Yeah, so there are no natural fires. So this is a deliberately put fire, so it actually burns entire biomass, and all the grasses. So grasses are extremely important as a pioneering species in restoration. So if they get burned, the ecosystem remains at the same kind of stage. So if at all you wish to save it, you don't have any choice but to have fire line. Then some such kind of restoration techniques were implemented in initial years, like the stone lines. So the stones which can just fit in your hand, you just arrange them along the contours, and as you see in the photograph, every stone line would have little soil behind it. And just because of that, a lot of soil and moisture gets arrested behind this, and now you can't even recognize this loop.
Even the seeds that would get washed off were arrested behind these lines. So that was a very important thing, because otherwise the seeds won't get a chance to stay on the land and germinate.
Then again, another simple technique, loose boulder bunds. So this needs to be done at a very right location. So this is to be a erosional gully and now you can't even recognize it. So these are all simple techniques which are implemented by using local stones, and this way tons of soil got arrested behind this bund, and it means you could save this from going to the backwaters of the Koina Dam. Then another thing that we did was percolation ponds. So these are very small ponds, 10 to 15 feet in diameter, just to assure that water is percolated, because otherwise this surface was so hard initial years that the entire water would wash off in the form of surface flow. Nothing would get percolated. So just to initiate that, so of course grasses and the roots, wads of the grass, each grass does the same function. But till the time grasses were taking root and were increasing in the size, we did such kind of physical structure. Also stream restoration. So the idea was just to reduce the velocity of water and maybe try to shape up or restore the riparian zone. So this simple technique. Then this is one very pinpointed location here on the side, which is called as headward erosion. So it's a type of erosion in geology, in which erosion keeps on increasing every year to the headward side. And no one had seen in that village any single blade of grass in many years. So it was definitely a challenge, still a challenge, certain part. So what we did, simple thing, again, we had a stone bund just to stop that head side erosion. The other side, we had a very long bund. So just because of that, we started observing many changes. The same thing happened, nothing new, just the soil started arresting behind the bund, seeds started arresting, and now you can see a lot of biomass is getting regenerated. Many new herbs, this is the tallest herb in Western Ghats, Lobelia. It also came on its own, nothing is planted here. Many senecio species on their own, they started coming up. And then this was our aim, that ultimately, even in summer, this particular barren patch should have some kind of insulating layer in the form of grass. And that's ultimately happened. So this is how you can see. So it's me in the photograph, and Manasi has used me just like a scale. So if you see in the first photograph, I used to get fitted completely well in that pit. And slowly, if you see, that much soil got arrested here. And so also the biomass, does it increase? And also it provided habitat for n number of butterflies and insects. So along with these physical measures, we also did plantations, but very much scientifically. We studied the forest around, and this is the community in the forest, like mango, jamun, and then there are two more species, Ain and Pisa in Marathi we call it as. So those are dominant in that catchment. So we prefer to plant many of those, and maybe other rare species, not in very great number, but very few. And we got really good results. So this list, maybe you may not be able to read it, but this is just to show you that we followed that forest composition even while doing the plantation. Then we also did seed dispersal. That's another excellent thing, but you have to do seed dispersal in a very right place, because barren land, many times people feel that you have to do seed dispersal on barren land, but barren land definitely won't be able to germinate that seed because completely barren, because the right kind of seed germination needs some kind of bacteria and fungi to initiate that germination, but that doesn't happen on barren land. So obviously it's a
or even sustaining that germinated seedling into a full-fledged tree or a shrub that needs some kind of soil moisture and soil fertility. So that is not available on barren lands.
Yeah. So what we saw is improved habitats and improve micro habitats, I must say, because this patch is of just 24 acres. So in that, we could see layers of various vegetation, grasses, everything, and provide habitats to microfauna. That is extremely important. So you have bacteria in the topsoil, you have fungi. Around that, a typical vegetation gets formed on which invertebrates. So many times we know only megafauna, like tiger or the birds are the ones which are very attractive. But there are n number of invertebrates which are equally important to shape topsoil ecology. So that started happening in initial years. Another wonderful thing happened in the land is soil temperature decreased. And this is extremely important. Otherwise, in this 56, sometimes it would also get heated up to 60 degrees. So in such a soil, no microbe would actually thrive. So if you wish to have a diversity of microbes and invertebrates, you need to have lower temperature. And this could happen just with the help of grasses. Means we've not given temperatures beneath any tree or shrub. So then the indicator species chain means actually biodiversity is an excellent indicator of what's happening on the land. So earthworm size increased, their casting increased, wonderful conditions were developed. Then new habitats. So just outside the project land, you won't see such kind of creatures like this tiny insect, tiny spider, which is called a signature spider. But within the land, you would have like thousands of the signature spider. Then obviously butterflies increase. Then another wonderful indicator of increased insect population is this reptile. So I'm sure many of you might remember in school days, we have learned that ecological pyramid. And in the ecological pyramid, this base is very important, where the numbers of micro fauna is extremely important. So that has to be broad enough to support the apex species. So all these are like heroes of the land. These are what are extremely necessary. Indicator of low temperature of soil. Earlier, we would not spot a single snake, but now we can see those. Also, another indicator is leeches. So earlier in Western Ghats, few areas were home to leeches, but now slowly, obviously because of degradation and high temperature, we're losing them. So they are coming back to the land. So we are quite happy about it. Another thing that maybe many of us can relate to this, that watering it. So the saplings which were planted, we used to water it initially immediately after monsoon. But now, just with the grasses and soil moisture restored, we water those saplings only in the April or May. Yeah, so that's how soil moisture is restored. So that's what the aim of the project was, that you actually improve the soil moisture so that you improve the germinating capacity. And so you let the soil flourish on her own. That was the aim. Then there are many rare species, as you see in Atul's hand. So this is the owner of the land. And in his land, there is a snake named Russell's kukri. It's a non-venomous snake. But yeah, so we were quite happy to receive such kind of rare species. This is another extremely rare species in Western Ghats. It's Sicilian. So Sicilian is a limbless amphibian. So it comes from the frogs group, actually. So obviously the younger one we've seen. So some female must have found this land safe for breeding. That's what we thought. And this is how the change was. Initially, only seasonal grasses were there. It would go complete brown. So which was replaced with perennial grasses. So in any restoration project, it's a barren land. In any case, this restoring grasses is the first stage. And this is this within this one slide. I'll just tell you the story of this entire project, and maybe we'll stop here. So this was the first year with completely seasonal grasses. And we have kept birds as an indicator, though there is a range of diversity associated with this stage. So birds like bulbuls and bush chats, which you also see in the cities, were common in the first stage. And slowly when it got replaced with perennial grasses, so perennial grasses are the grasses which would stay till the next monsoon. Though they are not like, they don't remain green, but for sure some kind of insulating layer is remain.
So their roots and clumps, they remain in the soil.
Yeah. Then slowly, even perennial grasses on their own got replaced with shrubbery. Means none of this shrubbery is planted. So whatever saplings are there, you can't even make out where it is planted, as I said, because focus was not plantation. So Western Ghats on its own slowly going or successing towards this forest formation. And so obviously the indicator species changed, or say not changed, but got added, like pipits and shrikes. They started breeding, they started nesting in the site. So that's an excellent indication. Then shrubbery keeps on maybe increasing in size, and habitats for different birds are now you can see. And this is year 14. And in this now you can see forest birds like this gray jungle fowl, spur fowl. So right from open country birds, so from open country birds to this forest birds. So this is a journey which is maybe just ongoing. And it's not like we have many years to go on this particular path, but for sure you can see that succession definitely is inevitable if you do the restoration and rewilding in a very right way. And obviously this kind of project has certain social benefits because you employ local people. Then you also get good quality grass as a fodder for local people's cattle. That's extremely important. Otherwise, cattle is all the time only on the inferior kind of quality grasses. So this is where we are. So we are not sure how much time it will take. Just that we are observing that how the process.
Ketki and Mansi, thank you so much. This was absolutely fabulous. Now, I think let's get down to the discussions and I'll hand over the mic to Isha.
Yeah, thank you so much, That was a really interesting case study. I had no idea that so much could be done, and it was really inspiring to see how the land was progressing.
1 second, Isha, can you stop sharing the screen, please? Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks. Great. So yeah, let's move on to the panel discussion segment. We've actually received quite a few questions from the audience, from social media, email, and the chat box, and a few also in the Q&A session right now. But I'd also encourage our attendees to voice their own questions. Please feel free to use the Q&A function on Zoom. So I'll start off with some of my own questions. I guess one that was a bit briefly touched upon earlier by Pranay, but I guess I wanted to understand, what do you think, all of you actually, what do you think is the role of government versus the role of businesses or the role of individuals? How do you draw that distinction? I don't know which of you wants to go first.
Yeah, so everyone has got a role. No, so everyone has got certain role, of course. So as an individual, so there are two ways that you can work on land if you have land, or you can have some kind of sustainable lifestyle. There are two ways that how an individual can just try to maybe help Earth in one or the other way. Government also needs to have a very important role in terms of maybe policy making. So right now means it could be a different session altogether, that if we start commenting on the economic system that we have all over the world and even in India for that matter, that so definitely that needs to be changed. Your policy has to be aligned for nature conservation. So that's definitely sure. And the third target, what you said, the third stakeholder, government, individual, and
Businesses.
Yeah, so of course, so businesses, so there are certain things like CSR, for example. But in CSR, what happens that the people, they keep on, say for example, polluting the environment, and they keep on donating just to mitigate that. So that's not going to work. Means at some point of time, you need to stop polluting. Yeah, so industries must look at their own policies, their own manufacturing thing, whatever they're doing, whatever they're manufacturing. So they need to bring in very much radical change in their mainstream. Yeah, and unless and until they do that, there's not going, many things won't change. So for sure, various stakeholders definitely can contribute, but you definitely need some kind of solution which is not end of the pipe solution, but just at the beginning of the pipe. So that's what is extremely important for each stakeholder. Yes, anything else?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. I think it's not either or. So, like in the current situation, I think you've got private players working towards manufacturing vaccines. You've got governments delivering those vaccines. You've got civil society making sure that anti-vaccine messages are mitigated, and they kind of promote people to come out and get themselves take the jab. I think it's we need to get over this thing that who's going to take the ownership. I think time's running out. I don't think governments nor corporations nor civil society organizations can wait any longer. I think the problem is far graver, far more problematic than ever was. I think that the pandemic is making us realize that it's got to be a joint effort. And the good thing about the pandemic has been that pharmaceutical companies have not made the most unkindest cut. If they wanted to, they could have made trillions of dollars, and rightly so. I mean, that they're in the business, right? And they're actually serving a constituency of people who are looking for profits. That's why they invested in it. The same thing holds for governments. But I think it's an a race to extinction for all of us. It's not just corporations or individuals or cities that are going to get sunk under rising tide. And all those kind of things, or sea levels. So I think we need a global consensus. Currently, the leadership globally and within countries is weak. It's still very fragmented. Developing countries pointing fingers towards the rich countries, saying that we need to produce as much greenhouse gas as you did, only then shall we, till we reach that. And those kind of things don't work anymore. I think there has to be a global consensus. So I think, it's up to the next generation. I think it's very easy for us to pass the buck now to people like Isha, that, you guys have to find the solution, because we're only going to give you the kind of solutions that you should not be doing, right? But I think on all fairness, we should stop passing the buck. And I think, again, going back to the chat thing about market-based solutions and other things, I don't think nature will, like in this case, the virus is not waiting for you to, label it, name it. I mean, for the first 3 weeks when the virus came out of China, we were calling it names, and we fought. The scientific community was fighting on very petty things like, should we be calling it this or that? The virus is not waiting. By that time, it's gone and done its job. And even now, it's like that. So let's value time, value resources, and whatever we've got so far. And I think the time for greed is over. Basically, that.
Thanks a lot. That I completely agree, especially on the blame game part. I think another thing that this kind of relates to is one question we received from the audience, which is that while it is important to change our lifestyles to be more sustainable ones, is there anything more people could do to play their role in the climate battle? It's quite connected to this role of individuals part. So I thought I would address this right now. Would anyone else like to? Ketki, Mansi, would you like to take this one?
Maybe in a line that you have definitely seen what can be done on land, but maybe if you are already living some kind of sustainable lifestyle, there are very few people, let me tell you, who are living such kind of lifestyle. So awareness creation has to be done. So maybe if we could just spread the word that how human beings and nature are absolutely connected, and that's why few people are shifting to sustainable lifestyle, but maybe there are just 1% of the people who are doing that. So there are still a large chunk which needs to be made aware. So I think all these people who are already on this path, if they could spread the word, nice.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. Another question we received from our audience members is, how do you change behaviors that have formed over centuries and generations? And I think that could apply to really specific things that you spoke about, like burning of lands, or it could be broader, in terms of just valuing our earth, I think, and taking it more seriously.
Yeah, but again, when we are talking about behavior, it also, again, because we have such a heterogeneous society, means you can't have one standard set of guidelines for each and every kind of society. So again, it would vary, right, from cities to rural areas to natural areas. So everywhere, so behavior has to be maybe tuned, if at all we wish local community or urban community to be in tune with nature conservation. So obviously there would be different kinds of suggestions, I think. So, but yeah, for sure.
Yeah, change in behavior is must. So that is something that goes as underlined.
I think, my 2 cents, I think people change behavior when you have a strong deterrence. Because if you have taken things for granted, I think if you were to look at religious practice, for example, I'm very critical. I've written about this, that, just before summers, we have Holi, in which you cut a tree and burn it an evening prior. And then you use a lot of water and chemicals, which will go and spoil the water resource, whether it's groundwater or your lake or your pond, right? So it's kind of strange, right? You're going to be running short of water in a few months, and you're kind of polluting it. The same thing happens during Diwali. You're reaching a time when air is going to be really bad, and you're going to burst crackers, right? So, what you need is that, things that were practices done a few hundred years ago or 1,000 years ago, whatever time frame you want to take, that's fine. But, it's no longer acceptable. Right. So it's a hard way to accept certain things, and a certain thing is a no, because your survival depends on it. Right. So I think there's got to be taxation. You've got economic disincentives. You need to have regulatory measures. You need to have, I think sometime in the future, by say 2050 or maybe 2070, I think companies are going to get, you have energy ratings, which nobody follows anyways. But I think, company licenses will happen. based on how much carbon you're going to produce. And they say, listen, this is unfeasible because you're going to be producing and transporting your goods it's such a huge distance. You're going to use so much energy to produce this good. We're sorry, we can't give it to you. You have to be more efficient to produce because Earth can only take this much and we can mitigate that carbon only at this level. So there's got to be somebody, some global agency and national agency that manages that ledger of how much carbon emission can take place, and a strict one, and how much mitigation can take place. And it's got to be very, very micro, and you should be taxed and you should be fined. People get away. I mean, you look at the fines that you have for environmental problems. Look at quarries. I mean, we take a surcharge from mines before the mining happens, but look at the way the mines are left behind. And right in the middle of Mumbai, I mean, you just have to look at Gilbert Hill, I mean, or Sivri. And you people are in Mumbai. I don't have an equivalent for right away for Pune, but something like that. It's not been replanted. In fact, it's been encroached. People have come closer to that beautiful volcanic neck and ruined it, right? So my point being here that there's no aesthetic price, there's no ecological price, there's no water cost. Nothing is looked at comprehensively. Just because the builder has been given a license to build next to Sanjay Gandhi National Park or next to Gilbert Hill, they ruin what is of human value, of global value, what should be valued by the world, right? So our short-sightedness happens because of small, petty, corrupt officials who have no longer view than that of winning the next election or making the next 1 crore rupees that they want to. That's it. It's as simple as that. But we have to stop it. I think this is where accountability of taxpayers and anybody, even corporate tax. I'm surprised that you have associations abroad that actually check how corporate taxation has been used by the government. We don't have one in India because corporate taxation is seen as a fee to keep the government at bay, but it is not used. Government is not held accountable by either the corporations or us as taxpayers, right? So I think that's a disjunct in our democracy or the way we function as a country. So I think that's fundamentally also the problem.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, completely agree with a lot of what you said. I think moving on to more of the restorations specifically, we have a question from Siddharth Bhattacharya, who is asking if anyone has an example of large-scale restorations in India and or the rest of the world, and any learnings there are from the same. I think we can also club this with another question that came in regarding if there are success stories coupling renewables or other market-based solutions with nature-based solutions like restoration. Yeah, those are the two things I'd love it if anyone could answer that.
Yeah, so there are few examples of large-scale restorations in India. So there are many people all over India, and somewhere in bits and pieces they're working. So if you talk about Maharashtra, even there was one earlier question related to market, I think. So this particular one of our very favorite project of grassland restoration, because central Maharashtra has such a low rainfall and semi-arid area. So there is this village named Lamkani near Dhule, in district Dhule. So over there, this 300 to 500 hectares of land was completely restored, and the savanna, beautiful grasslands are restored so very well within some 8 or 10 years. But it's not only about restoration. Basically, local people protected it to grow a superior quality fodder, because otherwise, if the grasslands are degraded, what you see are inferior quality grasses like Heteropogon, Marathi we call kusadi, so which are not palatable. Yeah, but the moment you protect it, you have some other community which we call the Lycanthum and Sehima. So this Paunia marvel are the grasses which are extremely palatable. So because these local people wanted to have good quality fodder, they protected it. And now the economy of the entire village has improved like anything within last 10 years. So it's a absolutely successful case study where an ecological, so they do not know that it's ecological restoration, but they protected it, they stopped fire, they stopped grazing, they ban on cutting. So all the things that we're talking from modern conservation point of view, they did it on their own. Community did it on their own just to avail good quality fodder grasses. And as a result, what they got, just because the now well-stocked grasslands are there, savanna is there. So it's not only grasses, but there are many acacias, and the shrubbery is also restored. Food chain is restored. And as an outfall of this, borewells and wells are recharged. Yeah. And also, fodder is, a lot of fodder is there. So just to tell you success of this project in just one line. So this project was initiated by Dr. Newadkar, one of the doctor in Dhule. So he says that 12 years back, he would not get 10 liters of milk, even if we collect from various houses. But right now, today, this Lamkani village, it exports 10,000, no, sorry, 3,000 liters milk every day. So that's really a great thing. They are able to protect their watershed. They are getting grasses, and also economy is getting benefited. Yeah. So there are many such projects, I think, in India, but with a short of time. There is Lekha Menda in Vidarbha. There is Timbuktu in southern India. Timbuktu Collective, Andhra. So there are people who are trying to do restoration, but because we have such a heterogeneity within the communities, that's why the replication is little slow. But that's why I think I thank Ra Foundation that such kind of platforms are definitely necessary to take such efforts to maximum people.
Okay, I'm going to go very quickly. I'm looking at the watch and it's 4 more minutes. So I'm going to just name my favorite projects. I like the work Sebastian Salgado has done. He's an amazing man in Brazil. I mean, just look at his work. Just Google it. He's also one of the finest black and white photographers in the world, perhaps ever. So you should look at his work. He and his wife have restored this gold mine that was deserted by the government, and he's converted into a tropical paradise. I mean, people come there to study ecology. That's absolutely brilliant. In closer home, I like the work of Suprabha Sessions. She's done an amazing project in Wayanad. I also like Jadhav Payang's work in Majuli, which is absolutely gorgeous. The riverine trees that he's grown to protect the low, the areas that were sinking in Majuli have been done very, very well by him. He's done it all by himself, alone. Nobody knew about it. Till somebody spotted trees from a distance while traveling in the Brahmaputra, said, how can a forest grow there? And, that's how it is. I think there's several other very good examples. And I will be a little biased here and say that I think one of the early experiments done by people like Vijay Dasmana and in near Delhi, in a place called Gurgaon, is a good example. I think Pradeep Krishan's 3 experiments in the Thar Desert to restore grasslands and local other varieties, especially of the dhak tree. I think Govindan's work in southern India is amazing. So basically, I have a long list, and I admire these people. I mean, the knowledge that they have generated by studying small creatures and plants and everything else, and putting them all together, making them come alive. Trying to show you a glimpse of what existed. A couple of 100 years ago, before we started to rape and pillage that part of the forest. So,
thank you. That's a really comprehensive list, and it's really inspiring to see so many people are doing so many good things. I think, yeah, so as we only have 2 minutes left and we don't want to take up too much of people's evenings, actually, I want to invite Team Ra Foundation and I want to ask one final question to them. I think it's a very important question that comes up quite a lot when you talk about nature-based solutions. And this is that, how do you ensure that the rights and the perspectives of indigenous communities are safeguarded when you are looking at reforestation in tribal areas?
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very important question. A couple of things that, we have learned over the years, that when any project becomes community-led project, the chances of rights violation or chances of success are extremely high. So all our projects are totally community-led projects. I mean, the community is involved in every single decision, from how to use the land, from land management, land usage, to which kind of saplings or seeds to plant, how do we give water. Tribal local wisdom is taken into account before making any decisions. See, rewilding is a very long-term project, like as Ketaki and Manasi also showed us the presentation, like over a period of 14 years, they have actually tracked the progress of their project. So clearly it's a very, very long-term project. And unless the community is excited about the whole entire project, it cannot be successful. And it is to excite community, it is very important that it is bottom up and the community leads from the front. That's exactly what we do at every stage. And importantly, somebody has actually mentioned that land is an asset, and how or why would people part with it? It is because we only look at lands which are barren. I would also like to add that what Pranay mentioned, that it is very important to look at the history of the land, what was there before. I think that's a great input that you have mentioned and given to us, and that's exactly what we also did. We actually asked the people who owned the land that what was there before, and they told us that a decade ago it was lush green with trees, but they kind of cut it off either for to get firewood or for agriculture purposes, but then they ran out of water and the land is lying barren. So I think this approach is very, very important, and that's how we can ensure long-term sustainability. We can ensure community buy-in, and ensure that their rights and rights are not violated at any stage. Once they are involved, they become owners of the project, and the project becomes sustainable and successful.
Great, thank you. I can pass it back to you now if you have any final thoughts to offer. Any of the panelists would also have any brief thoughts. We've already overrun by a minute, but if there's any final thoughts, and then we can conclude the event.
Sure. So, Ketaki, Manasi, last words, one line.
So, like we always say that conservation and restoration, like conserving whatever is existing, and restoring what and where we need to do that.
So restore the degraded and conserve
the existing biodiversity. That is most important.
Absolutely, absolutely. Last words from you, Pranay.
Mute.
You are on mute.
Sorry, I was speaking. Okay. I think Raha Foundation should, make this a model for the rest of the country to look at. And I think an Oikos kind of companies with entrepreneurial spirits and the right bent of mind, the right idea. There are lots of companies all over India that are saying, we will plant trees for a bank or a chemical plant or whatever in lieu of your carbon credit. So that kind of greenwashing is not going to work. I think those days should be numbered. We should look down upon people who are doing lip service. We should actually encourage Ketki and Manasi, and encourage, of course, Sarika to make this available, this opportunity available to companies like Oikos. It's only then that we are going to disrupt climate change. I think we have to be disruptive. Everybody wants to disrupt by making a new phone or something like that. I don't think that's disruption. The big disruption that's happening is nature telling us this COVID is an example of that. And we need to leave animals back there, and bats and pangolins and civet cats, what are being incriminated for SARS-CoV-2 need a home. And all those things that we do, we impinge upon their land and we get them out, and then we blame them for the problems that have been caused by us in the first place. I think that's the primary problem. We need to look at what the immense work that you're going to be doing in Palghar. So I look forward to coming there someday.
Absolutely, absolutely welcome. And I think there is also a need for creating a directory of all the organizations that are working on this particular very, very important issue from across India. And I think, Pranay, I would like to get back to you once this webinar is over, and also to you, Ketaki and Manasi, and let us together as a part of continuing our work, and let's not end the discussion with this webinar. Let's actually continue the discussion or conversation that we have started here, and create that directory and make it available to people, and share those best practices and case studies from across people from India. I think that will also be a huge encouragement to people, and people are lost as to how do we start, and at least that answer they will have found forever. And I thank you so much for this engaging discussions and conversation, and thanks a lot, Isha, for your moderation. Thank you so much. And we were wondering as to how do we thank you, and I want to just share a small screen with you. Can you see this? This is an Earth Day promise from Raha Foundation to you, Pranay. We vow to stay unabated, untiring, and dedicated to restoring our Earth. And this is our promise to you. And we have similar promises to for Ketaki and Manasi. Ketaki, thank you so much. And we promise that we will continue this effort that we have undertaken. And similarly, we have a promise for Manasi also. I'm just trying to.
Thank you so much.
So yeah, thank you so much.
So encouraging to see all these things. It's really.
Thank you so much. And we promise that we will continue and we will definitely work on the directory, which I think is required. And thank you so much. I declare that we have done with the webinar. I hope it was useful to everybody. And thank you so much for everything. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.